Here we are with Genesis chapter 28. I will read it. Are you ready? Genesis chapter 28. So Yitzhak called Yaakov, and after blessing him, he charged him, saying, "You are not to choose a wife from among the Hittite women. Go now to the home of Bethuel, your mother's father, and choose a wife there from the daughters of Lavan, your mother's brother. May El Shaddai bless you, make you fruitful, and increase your descendants until they become a whole assembly of peoples. And may he give you the blessing which he gave to Abraham, you and your descendants with you, so that you will possess the land you travel through, the land Elohim gave to Abraham." So Yitzhak sent Yaakov away, and he went to Padan Aram, to Lavan, the son of Bethuel the Aramean, the brother of Rivkah, Yaakov, and Esau's mother. Now Esau saw that Yitzhak had blessed Yaakov and sent him away to Padan Aram to choose a wife from there, and that as he blessed him, he charged him, "You are not to choose a Canaanite woman as your wife." And that Yaakov had listened to his father and mother and gone to Padan Aram. Esau also saw that the Canaanite women were evil in the eyes of Yitzhak his father. So Esau went to Yishmael and took, in addition to the wives he already had, Machalat, the daughter of Ishmael, Abraham's son, the sister of Naviot, to be his wife. Now Yaakov went out from Beer-sheva and traveled towards Haran. He came to a certain place and stayed the night there because the sun had set. He took a stone from the place, put it under his head, and lay down there to sleep. He dreamed, and behold, there was before him a ladder resting on the ground with its top reaching to heaven. And behold, the angels of Adonai were going up and down on it. And behold, Adonai was standing above it. And he said, "I am Adonai, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Yitzhak. The land on which you are lying I will give to you and to your descendants. Your descendants will be as numerous as the grains of dust on the earth. You will expand to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. By you and your descendants all the families of the earth will be blessed. Behold, I am with you. I will guard you wherever you go, and I will bring you back into this land, because I won't leave you until I have done what I have promised you." Yaakov awoke from his sleep and said, "Truly Adonai is in this place, and I didn't know it." Then he became afraid and said, "This place is fearsome. This has to be the house of God. This is the gate of heaven." Yaakov got up early in the morning, took the stone he had put under his head, set it up as a memorial, poured olive oil on its top, and named the place Beit El. But the town had originally been called Luz. Yaakov took this vow: "If God will be with me and will guard me on this road that I am traveling, giving me bread to eat and clothes to wear, so that I return to my father's house in peace, then Yehovah will be my Elohim. And this stone, which I have set up as a standing stone, will be God's house. And of everything you give me, I will faithfully return 1/10 to you." Kind of interesting, huh? That is a truly fascinating piece of scripture. Now, I want to ask you, as I did last time, I kind of like the way that worked out last time, without getting into any details or anything, what do you note, just taking a brief survey of what you guys noted in this passage might have piqued your interest, might have drawn a little attention to itself? Do you guys notice anything interesting or confounding or confusing?
But right away, I was kind of surprised that it never mentions that Yitzhak said anything to Yaakov about what he had done.
True enough.
Yeah, it just goes right on.
Yeah, it certainly does.
I just thought,
That's a curious thing, isn't it?
Curious.
Yeah. John?
I feel like that Yaakov got a little bit in a better spirit towards the end, and that's what he did.
Mm-hmm.
Now that, of course, what he went through, and also with that stone, and that he really shows reference now towards Elohim.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Keith or Mike? Mike?
Yes, just surface from the end of the last chapter to this, you see the wife giving instruction and then that instruction being followed. And I think you see that comparison with all three wives, you know,
Mhm.
from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob.
Mhm.
And there's all three of them married within the family.
Right. Yeah. Good insight. Good insight. Keith, first time?
Well, I was just noting that he went to, I should say Esau went over to Ishmael and married Ishmael.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I thought it was-
That's kind of curious, isn't it?
And in my Aleph Tav scripture,
Yeah.
you know, where it mentions her in verse 9,
Yes.
she has an Aleph Tav in front of her name. She has what?
An Aleph Tav. Yeah. Well, that's probably because the Aleph Tav, in a grammatical sense in the Hebrew, is a definitive article, and it's probably saying, because you know how that's like Spanish, it's mixed up, it's backwards.
Yes.
It's probably the daughter. Aleph Tav, daughter is.
I don't know, because of how it's worded. It's Aleph Tav, her name, the daughter of.
Okay.
So, but this is a unique
Sure. Yeah. No, I got you.
Bible.
That's certainly
I just
interesting.
thought it was fascinating.
Yeah, Jerry.
This is the first time I think in the book in Genesis where a man has tried to make a covenant with God and tell God, you know, if you do this and this and this, then I'll do this to you.
He's like making a bargain.
He's kind of got it backwards.
Yeah. No,
At the
I.
end of the chapter?
Well,
Yeah.
it started with about 28:15.
Yeah.
And then he talks about, and I'll give you a tithe.
Right.
If you bless me.
Right. It's kind of curious, isn't
It's a
it?
bless me, God.
It's like he's making it one of those deals, like, and you know, we know those deals. It's like when you're in trouble and you're saying to God, "Hey, if you'll do this for me, I'll do that for you." You know, God is gracious, and he might actually answer that prayer.
You might, yeah.
And we can get to this later. Tell me to hold it if we need to, but Tracy wanted me to point something out with the stone.
Oh, we're definitely getting there. You hold that thought.
And what stood out to me is it apparently must have been very dangerous to travel at this point. He's basically saying, "You will be my El if
Yeah.
I get back home safely."
Right.
Is,
Yeah.
You know, is what he's
And,
saying.
and we'll definitely talk about that because I think that's an interesting side note.
And it also looks like tithing was a common interaction with your God in this time.
Mm.
Like perhaps maybe the worshippers of other gods did something similar.
Yeah.
Because that's what he says, "You will be my God, and I will give a tenth to you."
Mhm,
You
mhm.
know.
We're going to talk about tithing too. Good point. Good point. Gracie?
I wondered what you could, where he's talking about that verse 21, it says, "Then Jehovah shall be my God." I already thought that it was established that Jehovah was his God, and he had received a blessing and everything, and now he's putting some qualifications on it.
It's a very peculiar passage. We're going to deal with that. Yes, that's a tricky little aspect right here. The last part of that is definitely a little weird, John.
For me, it's also more a question in 13. I thought it was blurry. And the whole mine says, of course, Lord, but Yahweh stood above it and said, it's almost like it was a dream, right? A dream or a vision.
Mhm.
So no one looked, of course, at Yahweh at any time, but it almost sounds like he was just looking all those angels going up and down, and then
Yeah, there's some curious things that you see in the book of the Exodus as well, where you think that, you know, it says pretty clearly, no one can see Yehovah and live, and no one has ever seen Yehovah, and yet you find in the book of Exodus that the 70 elders sat down and had lunch with God, and they saw sapphire under his feet and all kinds of weird stuff. So it's like, there's some anomalies there that you'd have to kind of look through. It's very curious, though. Keith?
by the way,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I wanted to also, I'm reading something lately about that sometimes Yahweh shows himself through an angel, the same as in Revelation. That might be an interesting question.
Yeah,
for
yeah.
next week.
That could be. There's a very curious section, or there's a very curious anomaly in the text there that we will discuss. Keith?
Yeah, you know, touching on this thing about the vision or the dream, and you know, he does wake up pretty excited. So then he wants to, you know, Jerry saying something about putting conditions on it, but at the same time, he's thinking how he wants to please God, but you know, he has fears about like how safe it is and everything.
Sure,
so then
sure.
He makes this oath So like you said, we all do when we're in trouble. If
That's
I can
right.
get through this, God, I'll do this for you or whatever. Right? So,
That's very common.
but yeah, it's very unique just to show that personal side right there between him and then the excitement he had to see the dream, and he really realized it was something special.
And this might be something for Angela to look at, but when he is leaving the land of Padan Aram to come back, he issues a similar proclamation to God, saying, I am afraid my brother Esau is going to kill me.
Yeah.
There might be a chiasm stuck in between those passages, something to possibly look at.
And I just want to mention also I'm curious what's special about Laban's house? What's special about Laban's city, Laban's family?
Good point.
It's obvious, don't intermarry with the Canaanites.
Right.
But to be so specific about Laban's
I will go ahead and address that briefly, and this is just from Chazal, which is this Jewish sages. I have wondered the same thing. Why are we so concerned with the Canaanite women, but we can send them back to Uncle Laban to get a wife from there? I mean, he's obviously an idolater, right? We've seen that pretty clearly. Well, the sages teach that Laban is definitely involved in idolatry, but that the Canaanite peoples are morally and ethically bankrupt. Now, I know that Laban is not exactly a lily white rose, in spite of his namesake. He's a shifty character, but the sages suggest that that Abraham's family has some semblance of morality, that they are not sexually immoral and that they are not grossly immoral, and that it is one thing to overcome that idolatry is easier to overcome than immorality, and that's the key consideration, is that the Hittites and the Canaanites in the land are morally despicable. And
a bloodline argument. I mean, the Canaanites were intermarried, and there's an issue.
Right. And that there's definitely some sexually immoral stuff, and burning their children in the fires and stuff like that. I mean, Laban is an idolater, but that's kind of like, I would say, if you got somebody who's an idolater, but they're a moral person, it's probably easier for them to be converted, perhaps, or that you would be able to deal with them on a certain level. Just because they're an idolater, they've got some confusion in their mind about who is God, but they have a moral, bank account, so to speak. I'm just throwing that out there for your consideration, but that's a good question. Angela?
I'm wondering why when he lays down to go to sleep, it says stones, stones at his head, plural.
Yes, that's true.
And then when he wakes up, it's one stone, and it says the stone, and it also has all the top direct objects, so it's almost like the stone.
Yeah, the
So
sages. The
stone
sages
to
teach
stone.
in some weird way that the stones actually rearranged themselves under his head and became one stone. And we're going to talk about that later, but that's definitely a weird thing. I don't know how to explain that.
Is this your cat outside, or
That is our newest addition, who
one's in?
it thinks it's our cat, but that is not actually our cat.
Just curious. That's why we wanted.
It's a very nice cat, and it thinks it's ours, but it's not. Okay, those are all very, very excellent questions and insights, and I can see that as we read this, that your mind is working in a good way. You're starting to see things that are sticking out to you and raising questions in your mind, and that's an excellent place to start. Let's go ahead and dig into some of this stuff. Now, note that, as one of you was mentioning, this whole thing about the deception seems to have been entirely glossed over, which is true. But I also want you to note that Isaac gives Jacob another blessing, and that this blessing, he knows exactly who he is. He's not being tricked. He actually says, may El Shaddai bless you and make you fruitful and increase your descendants until they become a whole assembly of peoples, and may you give the blessing which you gave to Abraham and you and your descendants with you, and that you'll possess the land. This is the blessing that has been passed down from Abraham to Isaac and now to Jacob, that his father gives him another blessing, this one seemingly more spiritual than the previous one when he had been tricked. If you remember, There were some spiritual elements for sure to that blessing that he got when he was being tricked. But that one, it says the dew of heavens and the fullness of the earth, it seemed more like a temporal type of blessing. What do you make of that? Is there two aspects to this blessing? One when he is being deceived, and one when he is seeing clearly, so to speak? How would you compare and contrast those two blessings and the circumstances under which they were given? Any ideas?
Well, one thing to say, this blessing might have been contingent upon him following that command. You know, it's because he says that first. He's like, here's the blessing, don't marry a Canaanite.
Right.
And he continues, and then you can compare that to Esau, where Esau tries to make nice with his dad by adding a non-Canaanite wife on top of the Canaanite wife.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, it's interesting too that in the stone edition of the Chumash, it actually says that that Isaac called Jacob, and after blessing him, he instructed him. Just gave him instruction of some kind. Is the instruction, don't marry a Canaanite woman, or was there some other instruction included? They suppose that it was, but I don't know. It's kind of curious. Yeah, I'm not sure. Keith?
Well, we were talking about how this got glazed over from the first blessing and the trickery or whatever. But you remember, Rebecca said, don't worry, I'll cover you on that one. It'll be mine. So, she had to talk to Isaac and explain, straighten him out about where the blessing was supposed to go and all that. But
yeah. That's a good point. And I think that, for maybe us to have some little takeaway, some little nugget for us to actually incorporate into our own lives is that we saw that his mother, Rivkah, tried to do the will of God, but in an unrighteous way by resorting to some kind of trickery or something. And we noted at that time that that's not necessary. And we can see from this situation that it's not necessary. Isaac, he received the blessing from his father Isaac, an even better spiritual blessing, knowing full well. Did Isaac change his mind and decide, well, I guess you've got the blessing, we may as well give you the rest of it? Or, hey, I got some more to add to that? I mean, something happened here. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but I think maybe a takeaway is for us, do things the right way. Things will happen as they're supposed to happen. You don't take shortcuts. You don't go about trying to do righteousness in an unrighteous way. It just doesn't work, and you're wasting effort you really don't need to use. Keith?
Well, then I believe Esau did admit to his father that, he did give his birthright away. If that conversation went any deeper, what do you mean he gave it away? Well, I was hungry. It didn't mean that much to me. Oh, it doesn't? Okay, well, now I know where the blessing needs to go.
The sages have actually suggested that very thing, that his father didn't know that until Esau, in his heat of passion, confessed, he took my blessing. He's like, what? I didn't know that. We don't know for certain. Did you have something, Mike?
I was thinking too with the specifics around taking a Canaanite wife, maybe that also goes back to when we were reading about Noah and what happened in cursing Canaan.
Yes.
If you leave your father and mother and cleave to your wife,
right.
And
right.
Canaan is supposed to be the one serving Shem.
That's true. Good point. Good point.
One other thing, and this might be a little bit more abstract, but I had been noticing that El Shaddai is used 6 times in Genesis, always with something fruitful. And I've been studying how they match up with the 6 days of creation. This is the second time it's used, and there's a lot of parallels in this chapter to day 2. So it might be something people want to look at.
I just want to ask, why it is El Shaddai? Like sometimes Yahweh or Elohim.
Yeah, and I think it's definitely contextually linked, and the circumstances that Mike is noting, I think, definitely have to do with that. But I mean, do you remember when we talked about the word El Shaddai when it first appeared in the text and what some of the meanings were? So many of your texts say maybe that God Almighty. One of them was Shad, was the breast, the breasted one. Well, that's a little weird sounding, but that's the breast nourishment and breast milk nourishment provides everything that a baby needs. So that's actually, I think, probably the root of where they come up with all sufficient. It's another interpretation. So that's an interesting, for sure, connotation there. I think you actually did a bit of research into El Shaddai. You'll have to share more of that with us.
You have it written?
Yeah, I'm still working on it.
Okay.
He's working out a paper. He'll have to present it to us sometime soon. Excellent, excellent. So, just a wee bit of trivia. You notice that when his father was getting a bride, that Abraham sent his servant to go to Laban with camel loads of wealth. Did he send Jacob to Laban with nothing? Because you remember when Jacob is leaving the land, he actually says to God, you know, you were faithful to me. I left my father's house with nothing but my staff, and now I have become wealthy in a company of peoples, which is interesting because that's exactly what his father said. Did he leave his father's house with nothing? No dowry, no wealth, no riches to maybe offer Uncle Laban to secure any kind of blessings for his wife? Nothing? Does that seem odd to you?
He was praying for bread and for
food and clothing, and water.
Yeah.
It's an
He's
interesting question, because Abraham's rich.
Yeah.
I was just saying, Abraham's rich, and then, like you say, you know, Jacob gets rich off of Laban.
right.
So he wasn't rich before, and it's like, yeah, there's kind of disconnect there, because we know Abraham was wealthy. He had 300 servants, and
Yeah.
took him out to war and stuff.
And it says that when, in regards to his father Yitzhak, that they remember that the king of Gaza sent him away because he was too powerful, too wealthy, which is intimidating to the Philistines. So he's got a bunch of money.
Whereas we know Esau was powerful, because when Esau comes against Jacob, Jacob is scared.
Yeah, he's got 400 armed dudes, and he's probably got plenty. I mean, he tries to give him all these gifts, and he's like, I got plenty, man. I don't need your stuff. But he presses him. But yeah, it's a little bit weird that he leaves his father's house with nothing.
I just think it's a good lesson to not have a crutch on what someone else was, blessed with, that you think you're gonna get blessed by being in the line, if you will. It's your own walk,
Yeah,
and you have to learn your own lessons.
yes,
And God sure showed himself faithful to Jacob
absolutely.
in this. And to think that with all that we've known of him so far, and the walk he's had and what he will have,
Hmm.
to be the one that God names the kingdom after
Yeah.
is phenomenal.
Absolutely. I think that that's a good point, and I think that's very possibly, I mean, that's what I actually have in my notes, that as a point to make in regards to this, is that both physically and spiritually, we start off with nothing, and we must build on what God is willing to give us and not all the stuff that we cling to. And I like what you said about learning to stand on our own, And maybe this was some sense of wisdom from Yitzhak, saying, I don't want my son to be dependent upon me. I know that we can definitely spoil our children, and to their own detriment many times, if we continue to support them and give them everything they need and be there for them every time they bump their knee, or when they're 20-something, they get in credit card debt or something, and we're like, oh, well, we'll help you out. Yeah, you don't really learn anything that way. So that's certainly a good point to make here, Mike.
I was wondering if maybe it's also a picture, because when Abraham does this, he sends out the helper,
Yeah.
right? So it's a kind of a picture of the spirit. So you've got this, the spirit goes, and then the man goes.
Right.
So he's following.
Right. Yes.
Maybe there's something there.
Good point. Good point. I like that. Angela?
If Jacob had gone in there with stuff and hadn't had to struggle with Laban, he would have ended up with the bride he wanted, and he would have had 2 cents. But because of the struggle he went through, he ended up with an additional 10 cents. Does that 2 and 10 ring a bell at all?
Hey, that's very interesting.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. I think,
I mean, that's how he became a great company of people.
that's true. I hadn't actually considered it in that light, but that's actually a good point. You know, if he had taken a bunch of money with him, he would have just purchased, in a sense, a bride from Uncle Laban, the one that he wanted, and he would have had a wife who couldn't have children for a while and then had 2 sons, potentially. But instead he ended up with 3 wives and 12 children. It's a good point, Keith.
Sounds just like his father.
It does, doesn't it?
Maybe he needed those 14 years to get him kicked around too, because I mean, maybe
Yeah.
he's kind of a mom's boy, maybe he's kind of soft.
Well, you know, and you got to consider too, that's not a bad point, Nathan. Frankly, it's not, because, you know, you look at this, it says that he was a smooth man, dwelling in tents. He might have been a bit of a homebody and needed to be toughened up a little bit, you
He
know.
was the favorite of his mother.
The favorite of his mother. He was a mama's boy. His brother Esau was out hunting all the time and kind of a manly dude.
Home cooking stew.
Ex-
Self-respecting man. I get it, but
That's a good point. That's funny.
But those 14 years must have. I mean,
I'm
I think
sure.
maybe Yahweh let him there because he needed them.
Well, there's no school like the School of Hard Knocks. That is, you know, it would be delightful if we could learn by wisdom, but a baseball bat is way more effective. Then you really learn those lessons. Believe me, I am a guy who learns from a baseball bat. I don't listen to people telling me you shouldn't do that. I got to do it for myself and screw it up. Angela? She's going to testify, by the way.
Which wives did Messiah eventually come from?
Which son?
Which wife did the Messiah eventually come from?
Leah,
Because Judah,
the unloved wife.
because only Benjamin and
Right.
Joseph.
Yeah, that's a good point. Good point. You know, have you guys seen, I know, Keith, you've got to have seen this, the Bible movie with Matthew Modine as Jacob? And you know, in that movie, they show that Jacob did leave with a bunch of money, but that Eliphaz, the son of Esau sent his son Eliphaz after Jacob and said, I want you to kill him. He gave him an assassination, you know, motive and went, go chase him down, get him and kill him. Well, in the movie, he actually didn't kill Jacob. He had mercy on him or something, but he took all of his stuff and robbed him. Now that is in the movie, and I want that. Where did that come from? But you know what? Huh? Well, no, it actually is in the Talmud. The Jewish commentaries actually suggest that that's what happened, is that Esau's son Eliphaz chased him down and took all his stuff, but didn't kill him. So I don't know. It's just a little piece of trivia. But there was one other thing that I had forgotten that I was going to talk about, but that's okay. It wasn't terribly significant. Any other comments, questions, or concerns just regarding that one section, Angela?
Was it stone and stones?
No, not yet.
Okay.
Well, I just think for, when you look at his life, and it was a hard life. After he leaves mom and dad,
Yeah.
and all that this guy went through, such agony with all the things his kids were involved in.
Uncle Laban, it started out, his home life was rough. His Uncle Laban's was rough. His children were rough. He had a really rough life, man.
He loved the Lord. You know, he grew in him.
Yeah.
But out of all of the patriarchs, his had to be the worst life.
It certainly was. Abraham seemed to just have the magic touch, the Midas touch. You know, everything he touched just turned to gold, and things just seemed to go smoothly. He was not rebuked for telling people that Sarah was his wife when things went horribly awry. I mean, things just seemed to go smooth. And for his son Isaac, we don't have a whole lot in the story, but it's everything we know is like smooth sailing. But then Jacob, everything just goes horribly, terribly wrong. And, you know, some people have suggested, you know, when Yehovah actually appears to him and makes a blessing, that he says, your descendants will be like the dust of the earth. He doesn't say the stars of the sky. And that has something to do with being trampled down. Being trampled down, being low, being despised, being humbled. And, you know, we know that being humbled is a prerequisite, right? God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves before the mighty hand of God so that he will exalt you at the proper time. We all must be humbled. And if we are willing to give up the things that we're holding on to, with both hands and all of our might, then he'll be able to take them from us, give them back to us, give us more than we ever really thought was possible. It's such an important lesson, and it's one that's hard learned. So, notice that, again, we have this thing that's happening in this text, which we have noted on at least 3 occasions, that when one of the biblical patriarchs goes through some type of a separation process, immediately God appears to him. Do you notice that in this section as well? When is the first time that you remember that happening? In our studies so far. Who separated from who?
Abraham and Lot said.
Abraham separated from Lot, and then God appeared to him. When was the next time? Who? Hagar. Oh yeah, Hagar separated herself from the family of Abraham and God appeared to her. That's correct. And then it happened again with Yitzhak when he separated himself from Abimelech. And now Jacob separates himself from his family and his brother Esau, and God appears to him again. Would you guys remember what we talked about in relation to why that might be? That every time somebody who's called according to the purpose of God separates themselves from some situation or some person or something like that, that God suddenly appears to them. Angela?
What are the words on our card? Kadesh. Set apart.
Set apart. That is correct. So what lesson might we learn or take away from that? Is there a lesson there?
Well, we know for Jesus was someone behind him. So, I was saying with Jesus, that was one of his things, was getting away very often. That's what he was marked by.
Yeah.
And I know for Enoch in the, I think it's in Jasher, where he was also characterized by spending a lot of time alone.
Mm-hmm.
That was his pathway to communion with Yahweh. It was
Okay, I'm picking up what you're putting down with regards to being alone, and I think there's definitely a valuable
just
point
saying,
there.
you can see like it being a big part of Jesus.
Yeah.
Jesus' life, at least.
But in these instances that we're talking about so far in the Tanakh, it's like he's not necessarily going to be alone. He's separating himself from something else. And that, I think Angela pointed out, that is the definition of holiness. So how do we appropriate that as a lesson for ourselves? Carla?
Well, what stuck with me from what Angela said last week applies to this in my mind about how God separates you to maintain the integrity of what there is there, the holiness for one thing, to multiply that to the future.
That's right. That's absolutely
I love
right.
how she brought that up
Yeah,
last week.
excellent point. Gracie?
I wonder if it has something to do with God separating, taking you out of your comfort zone so that you have only Him to rely on.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that 100%. I think also it has to do with us being willing and even desirous to separate from those things in our lives which either are not a good influence, perhaps, or that are. And this seems what's interesting to me is that the separation that we're seeing in every one of these instances is what might be considered a poisonous relationship. A poisonous relationship. That Lot and Abraham are together, and yet they begin to quarrel. And there's a different spirit between them. With Yitzhak and Abimelech, they began to quarrel. Remember that they were kind of like getting jealous of one another, and that they began to fight over the wells. There's a different spirit. They need to separate. There's definitely characteristics of a different spirit here between him and his brother Esau. So I think that perhaps a piece of instruction for us is there something in our lives that is detrimental, that is perhaps a poisonous relationship or a poisonous attachment that we have with something that needs to be separated from us in order that God would then speak to us. He's like, I can't get through to you right now because you've got something that's either distracting you or you're attached to something that is unholy, that needs to be separated out so that you can hear my voice more clearly. Angela?
I was thinking that maybe the separations are helping God define himself by providing a contrast.
Yeah.
It's like, here's this and here's this. I am like this, I am not like this.
Yeah. That could be a good reading, just looking at the text and saying there's some clear distinctions here between these two peoples that are being separated all the time. It's good insight. Mikey?
So the first time Abraham separates is when he leaves his father's house.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's the first appearance.
Right.
And so right after that is with Lot.
Mm-hmm.
And then this section here, and in all three instances, they build an altar and a memorial.
Right.
This
Yeah.
separation.
So this almost seems in that sense, and I absolutely understand that. I think God appears to him again when he's leaving Uncle Laban. So it's when he leaves his father's house, and then as he's moving around, going back to the land. I say there's a definite kind of parallel between him and his grandfather Abraham. That's very, very interesting. And I think if it might be that if we looked a little more carefully at Isaac, we might see something similar to that. I don't know the details off the top of my head, but that's certainly possible. But it's interesting that you would see it on both ends of the spectrum. Maybe not in the middle. There might be a lesson there too. John?
Maybe still a question. Jacob, was he considered, I know he's a patriarch, but is he also a prophet?
That's an excellent question.
I don't know if he prophesied anything of...
Well, he did actually make a rather lengthy prophecy at the end of the book of Genesis. Yeah, absolutely. So in the sense of, is he a prophet where he like predicts the future? Yes, absolutely. Is he a prophet in the sense of he is a man who hears from God? Absolutely. And is proclaiming a message of God in a sense, absolutely. The text doesn't say specifically that he's a prophet, but I really see not a whole lot of distinction between himself and his father and his grandfather in that regard. I think if you just look at it from the perspective of a prophet is somebody who tells the future, then by that account, yeah, he would be a prophet. He gives a very lengthy prophet about every single one of his 12 sons. And they were very detailed prophecies that came to fulfillment rather spectacularly. That's good insight. Good question. And you said, I know he's kind of counted as one of the patriarchs. He is actually counted as the patriarch, even more so than Abraham and Isaac, frankly. I mean, the whole kingdom is named after him.
Yeah, because I always wonder when later on we pray to the father of the list of three.
Yeah.
And I always wonder why.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think what's most significant to me is that the whole kingdom of God is named after this guy.
Yeah.
The kingdom of Israel.
Yeah.
It's named after that dude, and there's a whole, yes?
That guy is named after the kingdom. Remember, that wasn't his name, it was changed.
That's a good point. That guy was named after the kingdom and not the kingdom was named after that guy. That does make a difference. That's a good point.
I just find it, sorry to
No, that's okay.
interrupt again, but I still find it strange because he starts out so rough.
He ends rough.
He ends rough. As well.
He starts and ends rough.
He goes a little better, and he's being molded into a better person,
Yeah.
more spiritual person. But,
I think, frankly, that the only time in his life which he would probably look back on his deathbed and say, the only time in his life which might have been semi-enjoyable was the last 17 years he spent in Egypt with all of his children around him, realizing that his son Joseph was still alive, saw his grandchildren from his favorite son Joseph, and died in the land of Goshen, in being plentiful, living through the famine and being surrounded by his family. That's probably the happiest time in his life, because other than that, it's rough.
so that's why I always wonder, why do we emphasize so much in him? Is that because he was also carrying the seed forward?
He was carrying the seed of suffering and a prophetic shadow picture of the suffering servant,
Okay.
I think.
Well, he's important due to this passage we're reading now. Have we gotten to him wrestling? Is that was it? We just
No, that's coming up in a couple chapters.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
I mean that was his claim to fame, was that he wrestled with God. It's always interesting what God is impressed with, what Yahweh's impressed with in people. You know.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
It's his standards are a little different than ours, aren't they?
Yeah, what he likes. You know?
Yeah,
It's
sure.
Like, you look at David, like a man after my own heart.
You know,
Guy who's killed
every time
10,000 people,
every time
you
I
know,
look at David and I hear he's a man after God's heart, I think there's hope for me. Really think that way, Keith?
No,
Oh, okay.
I was following that right.
Okay. So I want to now bring your attention to in verse 3, where it says, "May El Shaddai bless you, make you fruitful, and increase your descendants until they become a whole assembly." That word assembly is what Angela noted previously. That's the word kahal, and that Angela talked about. Now, that word in, do you know what that word in Greek is? Ecclesia. How do they translate that in the New Testament? Choich. That's right. Circus. No, church. This is the first appearance of the word church in the Bible. And what does that tell you? That Jacob will be blessed to become a whole church of people. Now, that none of your translations are going to say the word church. That there's a whole separate reason for that. You know that this word assembly, kahal, is all over in the Old Testament. The word church is everywhere in the Old Testament.
Well, at least in English, to assemble something is to bring everything together.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that differentiates Israel from other people groups is that they've maintained an identity
Right.
throughout all these generations, and there are only a few cultures that have done that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's like maybe it's a blessing that you won't be dispersed.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they were a number of times, but they always came back
Sure,
to
sure.
their identity.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, not all of them. We still
Right.
black about 10 tribes, but
Sure.
But
Yeah.
a substantial chunk.
That's right. That's right. Keith?
So this is the prophecy of him becoming Israel.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you know, it's interesting to read the rabbinic commentaries regarding this. They make note of that special word. Now, they don't exactly know how to deal with that because they say, well, he became an assembly of peoples. Well, that's probably talking about that each of the 12 tribes was unique and like its own people group. I'm like, okay, that's legitimate in the short term, but you're missing the larger prophetic significance of may you become a whole congregation of peoples, you know, and we know that that will happen in the New Testament times in the Greek scriptures when the whole people from every nation under heaven are grafted into this family. That's a prophetic utterance. But what's curious to me also is, you know, when the New Testament goes to translate that word, ecclesia in Greek, that same word is used in the Septuagint, you know, the Greek translations of the Hebrew scriptures that was written, I don't know, 300 years before Yeshua was even born, translates that same word with that Greek word, ecclesia, all over the Old Testament. And so the bottom line is a couple of twofold, really. Number one, the church of God did not start in the book of Acts. We all know that saying. I'm sure you've heard that before. The church of God did not start in the book of Acts. It has been around for a long, long time. The second thing is, you notice that whenever the King James, you know that all of our English Bibles are essentially based on King James. I mean, that's the authoritative book of the Bible that was done first in our native language. Now others have come along lately, it hasn't been too long now, that they've come along and tried to do a better, more accurate, less anti-Semitic, you know, perhaps translation of the Greek scriptures, maybe a little more faithful to the Hebrew or the Jewish background of the text. But it's still interesting that when you look in most English translations, that when it's talking about Jews, it uses the word synagogue. When it's talking about Gentiles getting together, it says church. which is not even accurate, frankly, because it's the same word in every situation, and we know for a fact historically that there was not an Assembly of God on the corner of Ephesians and Corinthians boulevards, right? So there's no church, there's no Gentile church anywhere. They don't have church buildings. Where are all of the Jewish believers meeting? In the synagogue. Where are the Gentile believers meeting? In the synagogue. I mean, yeah, they would have house churches, for some of them would have maybe met on Saturday. We know from historical records, and I think that some of those were quoted by that dude who was horribly misinformed last night in yesterday's debate. That Justin Martyr was saying, we meet on the 8th day, the first day of the week. And I have no doubt that that's true. Does that mean that we can abolish the Sabbath because Jesus was raised from the dead on a Sunday? No. Do you want to honor Sunday, the day that Jesus was raised from the dead? Fabulous. Do it. That's fabulous. Does that change the Sabbath? No. So, eighth day, first day, Sunday, however.
Had 8 days in their week.
That's true. First, that was a very short period of time. That didn't last very long. It was a cluster frolic. But it's just curious when you look at the Greek New Testament. It's if you want to translate the synagogue of Satan, you're not going to say the church of Satan, right? We just don't do that. Every time that it's talking about the Jews meeting, we use the word synagogue. Every time it's talking about what is perceived to be Gentiles, which is not even historically accurate, we translate it with church. So this is interesting that the assembly of God, the church of God, is birthed right here with this assembly of peoples and Jacob, and it continues all the way on to this very day. Hopefully the people of God will be reunited. And you can also consider too that prophetic utterances, all of them from the Old Testament in the Hebrew prophets, talking about all Israel being brought together. That doesn't necessarily have to do with the 10 and the 2. Doesn't necessarily have to do with the 10 tribes of Israel and Ephraim and the 2 tribes of Judah and Benjamin. It could potentially be all of these other Gentile kingdoms that have been grafted into Israel being brought back together with their Jewish brethren. Now, if you want to say those 10 lost tribes are the Gentiles, that's fine.
Which they're prophesied to become.
That's true. I know the prophecies, and there's a good case to be made for that. Could you prove that with bloodlines and genetics? No. Undoubtedly, you could not. But, is it true? Certainly could be. Is it also true that it could just be a bunch of random Gentiles grafted into Israel? Yes. Does it matter either way? Not really. Not to me. But is it possible both ways? Yeah. There, I think, is the real prophetic significance of bringing the whole house of Israel back together. Is all of these, what do you got? Billions of Christians, nominally, who are worshiping the God of Israel. How many Jews you got in the world? 14 million? 20 million if you're lucky? That's a big significant difference in people. Where is this whole huge church of God? And it's a mix of you and me and them. Going to come together at some point, right? I think that's maybe a big significance of the prophetic utterances regarding the whole house of Israel coming back together. But, nevertheless, I digress. Questions, comments, concerns about that section? Okay, cool. You notice in verses 6 and 8 that Esau saw that Yitzhak had blessed his other brother, and that he saw that the Canaanite women were evil in the eyes of his father. Does it seem to be that he's learning something here? Maybe repenting? Is he trying to repent? Is he trying to straighten his path and do what is right? And how does that work out for him?
He's trying.
It does seem to me that maybe he's trying. He perceived, now wait a minute, my dad is actually blessing my brother, even though he just totally ripped me off twice. Doesn't like the Hebrew, they're the Canaanite women. He does actually seem to be potentially learning from this situation. It's also interesting that he says that he's noted that in verse 7 that Jacob listened to his father and his mother. There's one of those commandments from the 10 Commandments. Yeah. You honor your father and mother. And how old did we notice that Jacob and Esau were at this point?
He's 50 or 60.
Likely at least 60. Yeah, maybe even older. Some estimates have it in the 70s when this is happening. So they're still listening to the voice of their parents and honoring them. Esau seems to be picking up on that. He seems to be making some corrections, some course corrections to his life. Now, does that work out? Not exactly. Not exactly. Angela?
He doesn't separate himself from his Canaanite wives, he just adds to.
Yes. He kind of bungles it. He says, he notices, yeah, this isn't right. I'm kind of screwing up here. I need to fix this. I'll get a new wife, which is perhaps more acceptable than the wives of the Canaanites. Now, is it acceptable to take a daughter from Ishmael? To me, I look at that and I say, maybe. I mean, Ishmael was raised in the house of Abraham. Surely he's not an idolater necessarily.
Well, it's not bad, but it's not Padan Aram either.
It's not Padan Aram. And he might have looked at that and said, you know what, I'm going to sneak over to Padan Aram before my brother gets there and snatch a woman from there. I don't know. But he went to Ishmael and married a girl named Machalat, who one of the interpretations of her name is sickness. Now, your text will probably say stringed instrument. I like sickness better. But it just seems to me that he seemed to be getting some type of an inkling that something's not right. But it also reminded me of potentially someone who recognizes, oh, I'm messed up and I've been sinning, or I've got this problem in my life or something like that. And instead of stopping what you're doing and moving in a new direction, you don't exactly stop. You do move in a new direction, but it's not the right direction. It just doesn't seem to work. You know what I'm saying? He doesn't, like Angela, somebody mentioned previously just a moment ago, you know, he probably should have put away his foreign Canaanite women and then went and found a woman who was acceptable to the family, whether that's from Ishmael or whether that's from Padan Aram, I don't know. But he doesn't seem to have made a clean break with it. And so I would say that his grasp at repentance was perhaps half-hearted, misdirected. It also made me think of that passage that we were talking about with Paul's assertion regarding him, potentially Paul in the book of Hebrews saying that Abraham was a godless man who sought for repentance with much tears, but it didn't work out. I don't know. But I think there's a lesson there in Esau not exactly working that out very well. Questions, comments, concerns regarding that?
You briefly mentioned, you know, where it was not adultery, but this was also before the time that it was commanded not to do adultery, right?
Who is adultery? What adultery?
No, and you know, from that you might have hinted to, for in that time, if you would marry someone that is kind of family, was that still normal, or was it allowed, or was it still already known that you shouldn't do that?
Well, no. The only thing that we know from the Torah is that there's a prohibition in Leviticus, what is it, Leviticus 17, I think? Yeah, incest is prohibited, but it gives you specific delineations of what that means, and it gives you the direct relations. Now, the only thing that we know of is Abraham with Sarah. Is she really a sister? No. Is she potentially a half-sister or a cousin of some time? Yes. That does seem to be the case. Now, as far as what's the relationship between Isaac and Rebecca, for example? Well, they've got to be at least cousins.
Cousins, biblically? Very
good. So, yes, biblically, it does seem that cousins, that's not one of the ones that is specifically prohibited in the Leviticus. I think it's chapter 17. I don't recommend it. I'm not saying you should do that. I'm just saying...
Prohibitions against incest are Torah-based.
Absolutely, they are.
Or any other laws that have law.
Right, but it's mostly related to, you know, your mother, your father, your brother, your sister. It doesn't say anything about cousins. And so, yeah, it seems awkward to us today. But then again, for all of our moral sexual degeneracy, we do still have weird notions about sexual purity which are not actually biblically based. You know, I mean, we've talked before about the fact that older men would often marry young women, which today it'd be completely, you could go to prison, for the stuff that they do.
Well, polygamy, that's a big one compared
Yeah.
to our culture today.
But I mean, you can, look at that dude. Who was that great Balls of Fire guy who played the piano and married his cousin? It wasn't against the law as far as I know, but he was castigated socially for doing that. But yeah, absolutely. Who was going? It was Gracie.
I think that possibly it wasn't so much. God saw down through the ages the DNA being too close together is going to cause health problems for the offspring.
Yeah.
I think.
I have
because
considered
God
that. Yeah.
To begin with Adam and Eve, it needed to be
Sure.
close relationships.
Right.
Because of the fact that it started with two people.
Sure.
And be fruitful and multiply can
Right.
only happen one way.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
as it with further into the Bible and further into Genesis here, you're just starting to see that the Lord is kind of pushing it away.
Yeah.
Not so much as a rule, except for in the Torah when it talks about.
Yeah, I have thought about that for a long time. Since I was younger, it's like, well, maybe as our DNA keeps degenerating over time, it's like you just don't do that because
Well,
weird.
that happens.
Sure.
Look at the people from Samaritans. Look at in the Amish communities. They end up with a situation where everybody's been around so many generations, and they just aren't. They have to swap kids back from one section of the country to another, so as to give some pure bloodline.
New blood. Yeah, the blood has become contaminated, Mikey.
Do you think that while he might be trying to please his father, there may be another motive for why he went to Ishmael? Because it seems like 14 years later he's amassed an army.
Yeah. Well, it's closer to 20 years, but yeah, that's.
And we know Ishmael had 12 kids and princes or whatever, right?
Yeah. And yeah, that's true. And I think that you can see, if you remember the prophecy that was given to Hagar regarding her son Ishmael, that he would be a wild donkey of a man, or a man in the shape of a wild donkey. If you remember, that's what the text literally says. It's not a wild donkey of a man, it's a wild donkey in the shape of a man. It's more like a beast than a man. I think that there's a unity of spirit there between them. That Esau is described as a beast, a hairy beast, who loves hunting beasts and is all about beasts and being out in the field. You're very earthly, and I think that you see they have probably an affinity, a spiritual affinity for each other, Mike, is what I would maybe suggest, is that there's a spiritual connection between them. Now, is there a spiritual connection between the patriarchs and Padan Aram and Bethuel? I don't know. That seems weird to me, but who knows? You note that in this next little section here that he came to a certain place. What is that place? Anybody know what place this is? The text just says a certain place, which is also worded in a kind of strange way in the Hebrew, and there's a bit of mysteriousness here. No, you know what this place is? What does Jacob say about this place, Keith?
Well, he's going towards Haran.
Mm-hmm.
So is it someplace in the past that his father,
Well, we know it's a place that his father, right here in chapter 9, verse 19, it tells you it's Bethel. The town had originally been called Luz. Angela?
What's the difference between Bethel and Beth-Uel back in the Tom?
They're spelled really differently.
So it doesn't mean house of God when it's
No.
Okay.
No.
And Haran is,
That's actually a chet and not a hay.
is that Abraham's brother or Sarah's brother?
Yes.
Haran?
Right. Abraham's brother, yes.
Son of Terah.
Right.
And then maybe Sarah's dad?
Yeah, well,
Maybe.
potentially. We're not really sure.
Yeah.
But this certain place, the clue is given when he says, what does he say here in verse 17? This is the house of God.
Your almond people would have a lot to say
I'm sure they would.
Well, we're talking about what he's viewing as a portal.
Yes.
Right? He's saying this is a portal. This is a holy place.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we might view it as, oh, well, he's having a vision in the spirit realm. It's not connected to something temporal, physical where he is. But to Jacob, it's like, this is a portal. This is
Right.
This is
This is the place.
I don't have this, so I'm asking a question. Does anyone know what the Hebrew word there is?
There?
The Hebrew word for a certain place.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, chapter 28, verse 11. Let's take a look at that. It's Hamakom.
Makom.
Mm-hmm.
And Makom is a title for Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh.
That is true. That is actually true.
It's
Yep.
For what is it?
It's another title for,
Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh.
yeah.
Yehovah. What is Makom?
How come?
So I think, you know, what's interesting is that a lot of people have interpreted this place, this special place, is actually the Temple Mount. Bamakom.
Well, we know about where he is, right? We at least have a general idea. So is there a good argument for it?
There is a good argument. If he's going from Be'er Sheva in the south and he's headed up towards Syria, he's going to pass through Jerusalem, that area. And they have suggested that this is indeed the place. And that's why here in verse 17 and then later on, he actually talks about God's house and it's talking about Bethel. There is some reason to suspect that this might actually be the Temple Mount, the very place where his grandfather almost killed his own father in the Akedah.
Well, actually, Christ went up on the Mount of Olives. Maybe that's where it was at.
Yeah, that's possible too.
To me, there's a portal there.
Sure. Well, there's something, I mean, remember that the land of Moriah is that whole area. It's not necessarily Mount Moriah. It's a mountain of Moriah. You know, the whole place is called Moriah. They have suggested that he's actually at the temple. And you know that Hamakom means the standing place. That is the you know, the standing place to a Jew means the place of prayer, because Jews always stand when they pray. They don't ever sit or anything like that. They're always standing. The prayers that they pray every day, they must stand. That's why you see Jews with their little books standing and bowing. You know why they're bowing?
Candles.
Flickering like a flame.
That is one idea that I have heard. But it's interesting that when they're reading, you ever heard about a scribe who's writing the name of Yehovah, that he actually gets up and makes a blessing every time he writes the name of Yehovah? And they also do that when they read, that they bow when they're reading the name Yehovah. But when you see a guy who's saying his prayers and he's bowing continuously, that's just a habit that they've got into, so that as they're reading the text, if they come across the name Yehovah, they're always bowing.
And it helps also with memorization if you have a word.
Some kind of kinesthetic movement. Yeah, I've heard absolutely that as well. You know, I know that my own son, he does math really well when he's jumping and flipping and kicking.
Yeah.
It's just the way he learns. He can't do it when he's sitting still.
Well, if you're standing all the time, you don't want your knees to lock and pass
That's
out.
true, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So, Mike,
Are you going to tie this idea of the Temple Mount into the stone now?
I was thinking about it. Would you like to help me?
Sure.
Okay, cool. So, this certain place, we have noted that this might indeed be Mount Moriah, the Temple Mount that would be later built. Now, I want to bring your attention to the stone. Does a stone seem to be a particularly good pillow to you? Now, I've heard all kinds of weird things, and if you look into Stone Chumash and like Rashi's commentary and stuff, it's really interesting, the things that you'll see regarding this stone. One is that, as Angela pointed out earlier, there seems to be at the beginning a multitude of stones, but then it comes and it goes back to it, and it's one stone. It's like they join themselves together somehow and put themselves under his head, but that's not literally what the text says. But then he anoints this stone. What does it mean? What might you call this stone after he has anointed this stone?
Cornerstone?
It's a Messiah stone. If he anoints it, what does anointed mean? It's Mashiach. This stone has been Mashiach. This is the Messiah stone. What does that make you think of? Stone of stumbling, rock of offense, chief cornerstone, the rock that followed them in the wilderness. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff you can see here with the relationship of Yeshua, the stone. You know, what's interesting too is right at the end of that passage is the Hebrew word bow, which doesn't seem to be connected to the passage at all. It's just one of those little words that's stuck off there at the end of the Masoretic text, which doesn't seem to have any relation to it. What is the word bow? Right at, I'll point that out to you. It's right at the end of here, verse 13, and also again where it says God is standing next to the ladder. Yeah, but what does bow mean in Hebrew? Come. Bow means come. That's the name of a Torah portion.
Yeah.
Where is he finding where are you finding that?
Right after where it says it, here at verse 13, and at the end of 12, where it says it, describing the ladder. The Hebrew word bow is in my Hebrew interlinear. You can kind of, if you see it, let me know what your thoughts are regarding that. It's just not really translated. It's a little bit weird. Yours doesn't show it? I can take a look if you want to. Hold on just a sec. I can point that out to you.
I see it, but I cannot click on it.
Yeah, that's one of those words that is not clickable.
Oh, yeah.
That is not. It's because it's not translated. It doesn't have a. It has a Hebrew letter, or it has a Strong's number, I think, next to it, but it doesn't. It's not a clickable letter because it's not actually. Yeah, it's right at the end of verse 12. It says ascending and descending bow. It says this is H0. It's one of the. There's no entry found in the Strong's. It's right at the end of verse 12, just before verse 13.
Mine just ignores it.
Yours just ignores it altogether. Yeah, it's kind of interesting.
It doesn't mean anything.
Doesn't mean anything.
Where is it on chapter 13?
It's right before verse 13 starts.
Sounds like
Where's the
a
next
scribe
But
language.
you also said it was in verse 13.
I thought it was in verse 13. It may not be. I may have mistakenly pointed that one out.
Okay.
I'll have to double check
It's the
that.
end of 12.
It's right at the end of 12.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't think it's in 13. I apologize.
Thank you.
But anyway, so this stone is certainly weird and mysterious that he's setting up this stone as a memorial, that he's anointing this stone with oil, that he's got a head, this pillow underneath his head. Very strange things. Mikey, help me out here. Throw out something interesting. Or Angela, you'd probably be...
I can't put this together, but don't you find it a little strange that our letter from today meant the back of the head, and that Kahal, this called out thing is going on.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about, never mind, just a company of people. It just seems like the whole thing is, there's something.
And this company of rocks that comes together to one rock.
Yeah,
I don't know. Hold on, Mikey. Let's get these guys out of the way before we launch on you. Keith?
Okay, so we know that the stone is Aban, or Aban.
Yes.
Yep.
That's the Father and the Son together.
Right.
In the house of the Father and the Son, and he's putting his head on it,
Yep.
right? And he has a dream about the Father, you know, so,
It's interesting, isn't it?
yeah.
Mikey?
Yeah, for the heavy hitting stuff, I just, I think it should be mentioned how peculiar it is, what it says Jacob is doing. It says he takes a stone and he makes it into a standing pillar.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, this is a stone that he was resting his head on. So I mean,
Right.
how
Can you stand it up as a pillar?
I don't know how big Jacob was, but it's a pillar. It's not going to be huge.
Right.
It's not going to be very tall.
Right.
So what does it mean? It's saying when we picked
He
it
just
up
flipped
and
it
said-
over?
You know, I don't know. I mean, there's a very curious thing about
There is.
architecture in the Middle East is they have something called Cyclopean architecture where they have these stones upon stones
Mhm.
where there's no mortar.
Right.
Walls that are built without mortar.
Yeah.
and these stones are huge,
Right.
and there is a mystery to this
Mhm.
day how these, and you can't fit anything even in between them.
Right.
There's like a mystery of this kind of stone
Absolutely.
architecture, how they were able
Absolutely.
to do it. And, you know, also with Jacob, you know, later on you find with like the divoting of the reeds, and he's able to
Mhm.
have speckled,
Yeah.
speckled animals. And
Yeah.
if you read in the book of Jasher, there's an interesting thing about stones where they're kind of intimidating each other. The sons of Joseph versus the rest of the of Jacob's sons. They're doing this weird thing where they're disintegrating boulders.
Mm.
Like they take a boulder and they're disintegrating it, and like they're trying to pick a fight with Joseph.
Well, you know what's interesting about all these multiple stones becoming one stone under his head. The Hebrew commentary says that these stones were fighting with each other to see who was going to have the privilege and the honor of being underneath the head of Jacob. Really, kind of interesting and weird stuff. Yeah.
I just noticed something interesting in my top scriptures.
Sure.
In verse 18, talking about what Nathan was just saying
Mhm.
about Jacob rose up early in the morning and took Tob, the stone that he had used to lay his head, and set it up as a pillar, but in parentheses it says her.
Mm.
Set her up
Yeah.
as a pillar.
Interesting. Well, and I puzzled over that too, about this. How do you take a stone that's under your head and then set it up as a pillar? But you know, an alternate translation, which I think is just as common and makes much more sense, is he set it up as a memorial, not an actual stood it upright into like a pillar shape, but more of because that Hebrew word for pillar also has the connotation of just a memorial. So it doesn't necessarily literally mean that he stood it upright and it was standing upright, but it certainly could be. I'm not sure. Angela, did you
Is
want to?
there a verse somewhere about lifting a stone, or not being able to lift a stone? Or?
Yes, in the I think it's in the writing of Peter. He says those who try to lift the stone will crush themselves or get crushed by it or something like that. If my memory is serving me, I could be wrong. Mikey?
So, some of what I was going to say has been said, but I think we can probably tie some of this together. So we have the Father and Son in the stone, and as Carl pointed out, it says her.
Mm-hmm.
And then again, in that same sentence where it says he poured oil on the top of it, is actually translated elsewhere on her head.
Mm.
And this is also feminine
Mm-hmm.
in the word.
Yeah,
And so
yeah.
you've got this kind of picture of this stone representing this house of God, and we are stones representing the house of God. The church
right.
is referred to as
The bride,
feminine
yeah.
nature, right? And
Mhm.
so I just think it's interesting that in this sentence here that you've got these two feminine
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely,
tied together.
Yeah.
absolutely. Angela?
It almost speaks to the fertility or the multiplying that's about to happen with Jacob, because so far the fathers have had a hard time. You get like 1 kid, 2 kids. Jacob's about to bust out with a bunch of them.
Yeah, the multiplication
So the
is
whole
a
idea of the feminine introduced here.
good point. Yeah, Mikey? Anything else?
No, that was pretty much.
Okay, cool. Thank you for tying that together.
Just
You-
also with a stone being referenced in the feminine, it might, also referencing fertility, like what kind of stone would you lay on? Maybe one that's roundish, I mean, I don't know. But, when I think of stone and feminine, I think of a dome. I think of it like a dome structure, because that's, at least for the ancient pagan structures, there was a reference to...
You're thinking of a breast.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And
That's
actually,
certainly interesting.
that same word, if you look at Deuteronomy 21:12, is where it's translated as her head.
Mm.
It's the
Interesting.
same.
Interesting. It's interesting that you guys are pointing out about the stone having a feminine pronoun attached to it. You know that in this section where I actually put in reference to the ladder, you notice that I had the word it underlined. And the Father was standing above it. And it says, did you know that word it is actually probably better translated as him? Is above the God was standing above him. or standing next to him. This ladder is described as a him. And that really closely tracks with in the Gospel of John,
Yes.
where Yeshua actually makes a reference to this. And I would like very much for us to actually take a look at that. If you look at the Gospel of John in the very first chapter, chapter 1, verse 51, Yeshua actually makes a reference to this. And I thought we would go ahead and check that out. So he's talking with Nathanael, who he said, yeah, I saw you under the fig tree. And he's like, oh, you are the Son of God. You're the King of Israel. And he says in verse 50, Yeshua answered and said to him, because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe? Greater than that you shall see. And he said to him, I am telling you the truth. I am saying to you, from now on you shall see the heaven opened, and the messengers of Elohim ascending and descending on the Son of Man. That is a clear and direct reference to the angels of the Father going up and down on this ladder in Jacob's dream. Now that's a curious thing. But I mean, the implications are fairly clear. But what would you say regarding that? That Yeshua is the ladder?
Yeah.
What does that mean to you? What does it mean that the angels are going up and down on the Son of Man? And Carla?
Well, Yeshua is the connecting between heaven and earth.
Yes.
He's the connector.
Yes, he's the connector. Angela, is that what you were going to say?
Yes, and when I think of Jacob's ladder, because of the whole having to study letters every week, I think of the Bob, which is the connector.
The connector,
it's the
yeah.
thing that connects the temple to the earth.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I see Jacob's ladder, in my mind I see a huge Bob. And so I don't just see this, that Yeshua is the Bob, he's the connector between heavens and earth. He's the thing that's going to restore what was lost in the Garden of the Fall.
Right.
But remember, Bob also means and so you have this multiplication, this and.
Right.
That now the family will grow, because it's almost like he is and with the whole idea of circumcision, that's got to fit in there somewhere, with the, not being graphic, but with the idea of that we're going to be fruitful and multiply. That is the way it happens.
Yeah. This is Mikey.
And I think this is also what I have tied into the second day, where the waters are separated from the waters. This ladder is what connects the Shemim and the Hashim. Right? That you ascend up this ladder of the Messiah to get that word from the Father. And I think below he elaborates on this, because he says, this is nothing except the house of God, and this is, you've got gate, but it's also door.
Right.
So we know that the Messiah is
The door.
He is the door.
Yeah. I think that this section is really pretty clearly just such a powerful indication of the Messiah. I mean, we've seen him in other places for sure, but this one is like pretty blatant, I think. That just seeing the Messiah in this passage is one of the most profound ones. I mean, it doesn't get more profound except perhaps in the life of Joseph. But this is a really strong indicator. Angela?
I don't know if you guys remember this, but when we very first started talking about Genesis, the whole thing started with a bet. And what Mike just said, there was this little part in that week where we were talking about the separation, the upper waters and the lower waters, and this connector here. And we were talking about the Word of God coming through here. And that you had almost like, and I remember on the visuals I put a speaker, and it's like he spoke, and it was this membrane right here between the upper waters and the lower waters that allowed his word to come into the physical world. And so if this is a vav, the connector between the upper and the lower, that is the word. It's what allows God to make himself known through his words in the physical universe, which is in between This is the atmosphere. I don't know if you guys remember that when we talked about upper
Yeah,
waters, lower waters,
I remember
atmosphere,
that.
this is where we dwell.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In his house.
In his house.
In his house. That's right.
He makes the rules.
He makes the rules. That's a good point. Fascinating stuff. I know we're getting a little bit long in the tooth here. I apologize. It is time for us to wrap up. Well, you know what? We did okay. We did not yet get to this vow that Jacob makes and says, if you will do that. And I don't really even know what to say about that. I mean, it seems like Jacob's hedging his bets. But, you know, should you be surprised? Probably not. All of our forefathers do dumb things every once in a while, and I don't think this is an exception. Saying he's going to give a tenth back to God, going to give a tithe. This is not, incidentally, the first time that the Hebrew word for tithe is mentioned in the text. Do you remember when that was? That's right, Jerry. Thank you for that. That was when Abraham gave a tenth, a tithe to Melchizedek. So there you have it. Let's pray and we'll fellowship.